The phone rang at 1:47 in the morning. I was already awake. I'd been awake most nights for 3 weeks, not the kind of awake where you stare at the ceiling and wait for sleep to come back, but the kind where you sit at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and go over the same set of facts until they stop feeling like facts and start feeling like architecture. The number wasn't David's. It was his company's main line, a Seattle area code I recognized because I'd called it myself. Twice, before I decided to stop calling. I picked up before the second ring, and the first thing I heard was breathing not his, someone else's, and then a man's voice, careful and low. "Is this Thomas? I'm Mark. I'm David's supervisor. We need to talk about your son." I said, "Go ahead." Mark paused. He'd expected something else alarm, maybe, or the slow fog of a man pulled from sleep. I heard him adjust. "I'm sorry to call at this hour. I wouldn't have, but he's been here since 6 this evening, and he won't go home. One of our project coordinators found him in the stairwell about an hour ago." Another pause. "He was crying. He's been crying for a while, from what I can tell. He's not in a state where I can send him home alone." I asked, "What did he say?" "Not much. His name came up in our emergency contact system when I ran his file. You're listed as his primary." Mark's voice was even professional, the voice of a man who managed people for a living and knew how to deliver difficult information without editorializing. He did say one thing. When I asked him if there was someone I should call, he said, "You were the only person who could help." The kitchen was quiet. The overhead light I'd left on cast the same flat yellow it always did. The legal pad on the table had 3 columns of notes, the handwriting smaller toward the bottom, where I'd been pressing harder than I realized. I told Mark I was 3 hours south by car. I told him I would come. He gave me the building address and his cell number, and when I asked him to make sure David stayed in the building, he said he'd already arranged that. I thanked him. He said there was no need. After I hung up, I sat for another minute. The coffee in my mug had gone cold an hour earlier. I drank what was left of it anyway, standing at the counter, looking at the legal pad. 3 weeks, 21 days since David had called me from an unfamiliar number. He'd already changed his phone and told me, in a voice that sounded rehearsed and hollow at the same time, that he needed space, that he needed to make his own decisions without my interference, that he was moving to Los Angeles and that he thought it was better for both of us if we didn't stay in contact for a while. I had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "I understand." He said, "I knew you'd say that." I didn't know what he meant by it. I still don't entirely. Before I tell you what I already knew, tell me where you're watching from right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled. I put on my jacket, picked up the legal pad, and folded it into the inside pocket. Then I got my keys from the hook by the door, the same hook my wife had installed in 1998, the same small brass plate with the same small chip in the corner, and I walked out to the car. The drive to Seattle takes just under 3 hours on I-5 at that hour. I set the cruise control and drove north through the dark, and I thought about the last time David had cried in front of me. He was 9 years old, and he had broken something he wasn't supposed to touch. And he was more afraid of my disappointment than of anything else. I had told him then that the only thing that couldn't be fixed was silence, that as long as we kept talking, we could fix everything else. He had believed me. For 26 years, I had believed it too. The city lights of Seattle appeared on the horizon at 4:51 in the morning, and I took the exit I knew by memory, and I did not turn the radio on. 3 things have stayed with me from my years doing private investigation work before I went back to engineering full-time. The first is that people almost never lie about everything. They lie about specific things, and everything else they say is true. The second is that the most important information in any situation is usually the thing no one mentions. The third is that the moment someone starts controlling the language around them, what words other people use, what topics get raised, what questions get answered, that is the moment you pay closest attention. I retired from investigative work in 2003. By then, I had spent 11 years doing it, mostly contract work for insurance companies, and one stretch for a law firm in Portland that handled commercial litigation. I was good at it, not because I was aggressive or clever, but because I was patient. I could sit in a car for 6 hours and not feel the need to fill the time. I could listen to someone talk for 45 minutes and remember the one sentence that didn't match the others. My former partner used to say that I processed information the way a civil engineer approaches a load-bearing wall systematically, without assumptions, looking for the point where the structure is actually resting its weight. He wasn't wrong. I've been a licensed civil engineer for 34 years. The investigative work came in the middle, a detour that turned out to be useful in ways I didn't expect. When I went back to engineering, I brought the habits with me: the observation, the documentation, the willingness to wait for evidence before drawing conclusions. Those habits have served me well on job sites. They served me well as a father, too, though I didn't always recognize that at the time. David grew up watching me work. Not the investigative work, he was too young for most of that. And I kept it separate from home, but the engineering. Saturday mornings when he was in middle school, he would sometimes come with me to sites in Portland, and I would show him how to read a survey, how to walk a foundation, how to look at a structure and understand what it was actually doing versus what it was designed to do. He was good at it. He had the same patience for detail that I did, which surprised me because his mother had been the opposite: brilliant, intuitive, always 3 steps ahead of the documentation. She died in 2011. David was 23. He handled it the way I had taught him, which is to say he didn't fall apart in public, but he called me every Sunday afternoon for the next 6 months, and we talked for an hour. And sometimes we didn't say much, and that was fine too. After those 6 months, the calls continued. Not always Sunday, sometimes Wednesday, sometimes late Friday when he was stuck on a project, but they continued every week, without fail, for 12 years. He had moved to Seattle in 2017 for a project management position with a mid-sized construction firm. The work suited him. He would call me from job sites sometimes, walking through a problem out loud, and I would listen and ask questions the way I had on those Saturday mornings. And he would work it out himself by the time we hung up. He didn't need my answers. He needed a particular kind of attention, the kind that doesn't rush toward conclusions. That was the David I knew, not the kind of man who cuts off his father, not the kind of man who changes his number and moves cities without a word. I had watched him navigate difficult clients, difficult colleagues, difficult projects. He was methodical. He thought before he acted. He asked for input and then made his own decisions. Whatever happened in the 3 months before that Sunday call, whatever shifted it, did not start with him. He introduced me to Rebecca in February, over FaceTime. I remember the light in the room behind him was wrong too bright, the kind of overhead lighting that flattens everything, and he was sitting slightly forward, which was unusual. David normally sits back when he's relaxed. He sat back when he called from job sites. He sat back when we talked about his mother. That night, he sat forward. Rebecca appeared in the frame about 4 minutes into the call. She had moved into his apartment the previous month, he said, and she wanted to say hello. She was pleasant, articulate. She smiled at the right moments and asked one question about my work, which I answered briefly, and then she laughed at something David said and touched his shoulder and said she would leave us to it. She didn't leave the frame entirely. She moved to the couch behind him, which was still visible in the camera, and she stayed there for the rest of the call. The following Sunday, he called again, and this time I heard the moment it happened. We had been talking for about 12 minutes. He was walking me through a subcontractor dispute on a project in Bellevue, the kind of problem that benefits from a second set of eyes when his voice changed mid-sentence, not the content. The register. He went from explaining to reciting. "Hold on," he said, not to me. I heard footsteps, then Rebecca's voice, close to the phone. "Who are you talking to?" "My dad." A pause, then, "It's getting late." "It's 8:15. Another pause. I heard something I couldn't identify, at first a soft sound, close to the microphone. Then I understood. She had taken the phone out of his hand, not grabbed it, taken it. The way you take something from a surface rather than from a person, as if the distinction between those two things did not exist. "Hi, Thomas." Her voice was pleasant, warm, even. I'm sorry to interrupt. We have an early morning tomorrow. I'm sure you understand. Of course, I said. David will call you next week. Not David wants to call you. Not we'll talk soon. David will call you next week. A schedule delivered on his behalf by someone who had not been asked to deliver it. Good night, I said. The line went dead. I sat at my desk for a moment. The spiral notebook was open in front of me. I wrote the time, the duration, and one sentence. She ended the call. He did not. I noticed 3 things. The first was that David spoke slightly faster when she was visible behind him, not dramatically, but measurably. The second was that twice, when I asked him a question about his current project, he glanced back before answering, not to check if she was listening. He already knew she was listening. He glanced back to see her expression. The third was that when I mentioned the Portland house, a question about whether he might come down for the long weekend in March, she shifted on the couch, just slightly, and David said he wasn't sure about March, that things were busy, and moved on quickly. I did not say anything about what I had observed. There was nothing to say, not yet. What I had was a pattern, not a conclusion. A pattern is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of one. I had learned that in 2003, and I had not forgotten it. After the call, I made a note in the small notebook I keep on my desk, the same kind of spiral-bound notebook I have kept since my investigative years. Green cover, college ruled. I wrote the date, the duration of the call, and 3 lines of observation. Then I closed it and went back to the project drawings I had been reviewing before David called. The following Sunday, he called again. She was not on the call, but I could hear her in the background twice, once asking him something, once laughing at something on a television. Both times, his answers to me became slightly shorter. Both times, he redirected the conversation within a sentence or 2. I wrote that down too. The Sunday after that, he called 11 minutes late. He had never called late in 12 years. I wrote that down. A structure doesn't fail all at once. It fails at the point where the load exceeded the design, and that point was reached long before the visible damage appeared. By the time you can see the crack, the stress has been building for months. I had spent 34 years learning to find that point before the crack appeared. I was not going to stop now, not when the structure in question was my son. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before Mark's number appeared on my phone at 11:47 at night. I was at my drafting table, reviewing soil compaction reports for a retaining wall project in Beaverton. The window behind me faced west, and the light was going flat and gray, the way Portland light does in early November, that particular quality of dimness that isn't quite dusk and isn't quite afternoon. My coffee had been cold for an hour. I hadn't noticed until I picked it up. David's name appeared on the screen. I set the coffee down and answered on the second ring. "Hey," I said. There was a half-second pause before he spoke. Not the pause of someone who needed to collect a thought. The pause of someone who had already collected it, had it prepared, and was now executing. "Dad." His voice was level, careful. The word sat in the air by itself for a moment before he continued. "I need to tell you something." I said nothing. I've learned that silence makes people say what they've already decided to say faster than any question would. "I need to be fully independent," he said. "I won't be calling anymore. I need you not to contact me." The phrasing landed in a specific way, not "I want space" or "I need some time," phrases David would have used because David had always been precise about emotional language in the way that people who've thought carefully about something tend to be. Fully independent. Won't be calling. Not to contact me. Those were not his words. Those were words that had been given to him and that he was now delivering. And the delivery had the particular flatness of a man reading from something he had memorized rather than something he was feeling. "What happened?" I asked. "That doesn't matter. A beat. I just need this." I set my pencil down on the drafting table. "That doesn't matter." In 35 years, David had never said that phrase to me. Not once. David explained things. He had been explaining things since he was 4 years old. Why the block tower fell. Why the dog looked sad. Why the rain made a different sound on the skylight than on the window. He was constitutionally incapable of dismissing a question with, "That doesn't matter." It wasn't in him. It was in her. "Is Rebecca there?" I asked. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone considering an answer. It was the silence of someone who had not been prepared for that particular question and was now recalibrating. "I have to go," he said. The line went dead. Have you ever heard your child's voice and known, not suspected, not feared, but known that someone else had put the words in his mouth, that the person you raised, the person who called you every Sunday for 12 years without missing a week, had been handed a script and told to deliver it? I sat at the drafting table for a few minutes without moving. The soil compaction reports were still open in front of me. The numbers on the page meant nothing for the moment. I looked at them anyway, because looking at something concrete helps me think, and I had a number of things to think about. The first thing I thought about was the word independent. It was a specific choice. It implied that David was currently dependent, that the relationship between us was one of dependency rather than connection. That framing didn't come from David. David had never experienced our relationship as dependency. He had experienced it as continuity. There was a difference, and the fact that someone had reframed it for him told me something about what he had been hearing for the past several months. The second thing I thought about was the silence after I said Rebecca's name. It lasted 4 seconds. I had counted. 4 seconds is a long time on a phone call when you have been asked a direct yes or no question. It means the answer is yes, and you are deciding whether to say so. The third thing I thought about was what a structural engineer does when he identifies a load that exceeds design capacity. He doesn't demolish the structure. He shores it up from the outside, quietly, until the internal stress can be addressed. He documents the damage. He prepares. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. Patricia Okafor and I had worked together briefly in 2009 when I was still doing private investigations work part-time alongside my engineering practice. She had been in HR at a mid-sized construction firm then. Now, as I knew from a mutual friend, she was HR manager at the company in Seattle where David had worked for the past 4 years. We had stayed in loose contact, a message at the holidays, a brief exchange when her son graduated from Oregon State 2 springs ago. She was a careful person. She did not gossip. Those were exactly the qualities I needed. She picked up on the third ring. I told her I was calling about David. I told her I had reason to believe he might be under significant personal stress and that I was concerned. I told her I wasn't asking for confidential information. I was asking for something simpler. "I need you to watch for him," I said. "Not watch, just notice. If he seems like something is wrong, I'd like to know." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," she said, "is he in some kind of trouble?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." She said she would keep her eyes open. I thanked her and told her I owed her a dinner. She said she'd collect on that. After I hung up, I opened a new document on my computer. At the top of the page, I typed the date and the time. Then I typed, word for word, everything David had said to me, the pauses, the phrasing, the silence after I said Rebecca's name. A structure doesn't lie. It tells you exactly what it's carrying and exactly where it's failing, if you know how to read it. I had just been handed a set of readings. I was going to read them very carefully. Patricia called me on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after David's call. I was at my desk reviewing load calculations for a retaining wall project in Beaverton, a straightforward job, the kind that doesn't require much active thought, which is why I noticed my phone the moment it lit up. Her name on the screen at 9:14 in the morning meant she was calling from her desk before the first HR meeting of the day, which meant she had something she wanted to say before anyone else arrived. "He missed Monday and Tuesday last week," she said. "No call, no email, just gone. When he came back on Wednesday, I happened to be in the hallway near his office." She paused. "Thomas, he looked like he hadn't slept in 4 days. His eyes were swollen, not tired swollen." I set down my pencil. "I thought maybe a family thing," she continued. "A death, or something sudden." I almost asked him. But then one of the other project coordinators, a woman named Jess, came to me at the end of the day. She said she'd gone into the men's room to drop off a package at the supply closet next door, and she heard someone crying. She waited outside. It was David. I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside my window, a crow had landed on the cedar fence post at the edge of my yard. It sat there, perfectly still. He wasn't crying because he cut off his father, I said. It wasn't a question. No, Patricia said. It didn't look like that kind of crying. It looked like someone being pressed down from above. Have you ever watched someone you love from a distance and understood, with complete clarity, that the danger they're in is real, but that moving too fast would make it worse? That was the Tuesday morning with the crow on the fence post. I thanked Patricia. I told her to keep the information between us for now. She said of course. After I hung up, I added a new entry to the document I'd opened after David's call 3 nights earlier. Date, time, Patricia's account, verbatim, Jess's name, the detail about the supply closet. Then I went back to the retaining wall calculations because the wall still needed to hold. The second call came 9 days later. Kevin Marsh had been David's roommate for 2 years at Oregon State, and they'd stayed close in the way that men from that era sometimes do, not talking every week, but present at the significant moments. Kevin was a structural estimator now, working out of Bend. I'd met him 4 or 5 times over the years. He was the kind of man who said what he meant without decoration. I wasn't going to call, he said. I thought it was between you two, but I've been sitting on this for a week, and it's bothering me. David had called him on a Saturday, 2 weeks after moving to Los Angeles. He'd asked to borrow $15,000. Kevin had asked what it was for. David had said he couldn't explain right now, but he would pay it back within 6 months. Kevin had pressed him not aggressively, just the way a friend does when something doesn't add up. David had gotten quiet. Then he'd said, "It's complicated. Rebecca has a situation." Kevin had declined. He'd told David he was sorry, but he couldn't lend that kind of money without understanding the purpose. David had said he understood and hung up. Kevin hadn't heard from him since. "Rebecca has a situation," I said. "That's the exact phrase he used," Kevin said. "I've been turning it over. It didn't sound like his words." I wrote it down. I wrote down the date of David's call to Kevin, the exact phrasing, and Kevin's assessment that it didn't sound like David's own language. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Carol Whitfield, and she has practiced family and civil law in Portland for 23 years. I had used her twice before, once for a contract dispute with a subcontractor, once when I updated my own estate documents after my wife passed. She picked up on the second ring. "I need you to pull together a documentation on 2 things. I said, financial coercion and psychological control in the context of an intimate relationship. Not for filing yet. I want to understand the evidentiary standard. She asked me to walk her through what I had. I did the call from David, the 2 missed workdays, the swollen eyes, the crying, the $15,000, the phrase that didn't sound like his own words. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. "The financial piece is the easier one to document," she said. "If money moved, there's a record. The psychological control is harder. It's pattern evidence, which means you need volume, dates, specific incidents, witnesses who observed behavioral changes over time." "I have witnesses," I said, "and I've been keeping a dated log since the night of the call." She said, "Keep logging, everything." The third call from Patricia came on a Friday evening, 16 days after David had returned to the office with swollen eyes. She'd seen something that afternoon she wanted to tell me about in person, but she was calling from her car in the parking garage, so she figured close enough. David had been at his desk when his phone buzzed. Patricia had been walking past his open door and happened to glance in, not deliberately, just the natural line of sight. She saw him look at the screen, and she saw his face change. Not surprise, something closer to a flinch. He picked up the phone, read whatever was there, and immediately deleted it. Then he set the phone face down on his desk and sat very still for about 30 seconds. "I've seen that look before," Patricia said, "when I worked in employee relations, years ago. That's not someone reading bad news. That's someone reading a warning." 2 days before that, she'd overheard David talking to a colleague named Ray in the break room. She hadn't been listening deliberately. She was refilling her coffee, and they were having a conversation she wasn't part of. But she heard David say, in a voice that was quieter than his normal register, "If my father ever contacts me here, I can't." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Ray had apparently said something she didn't catch, and David had changed the subject. "I can't. Not I won't. Not I don't want to. I can't." I wrote it down. I wrote down the flinch, the deleted message, the 30 seconds of stillness, and the unfinished sentence. Then I wrote, in the margin of my document, not his words, not his choice. That evening, I called Mark. Mark Okafor and I had been in the same civil engineering cohort at Portland State in 1984. We'd lost touch for about 15 years in the middle careers, families, the usual drift, and reconnected at a conference in 2011. He was running project operations at the Seattle firm where David had been hired 6 years ago. When David had applied, I hadn't asked Mark for anything. I'd told David that Mark and I knew each other, and I'd left it there. That was the extent of it. Mark answered on the third ring. I could hear office sounds behind him, keyboards, a door closing. "I need to ask you something," I said. "It's about David." He went quiet in a way that told me he already knew something was off. "Go ahead," he said. "He's in a situation I can't reach him in directly. I think he's being pressured in ways that go beyond what he's showing at work, but I'm not certain yet. I'm not asking you to intervene. I'm asking you to watch. If something happens, if you see something that concerns you, I need you to call me." Mark was quiet for a moment. "Does he know you're calling me?" "No," I said, and I'd rather he didn't, for now. Another pause. "What kind of something should I be watching for?" "You'll know it when you see it," I said. "You've managed people for 20 years. You'll recognize the signs." He said he understood. He asked if there was anything else he could do. I told him what I'd told myself every morning for the past 3 weeks, that the most important thing right now was information, not action. That acting too early would close doors I needed to stay open. "Just call me," I said. "I'll handle the rest." He said he would. I believed him. I closed my laptop at 11 that night with 14 new entries in the document. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The cedar fence post was empty. I made a note to call Carol Whitfield again on Monday morning. The structure was telling me exactly what it was carrying. I just needed a few more readings. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing load calculations for a retaining wall project in Beaverton. My phone showed a number I recognized, Patricia Nguyen, who had been in HR at Meridian Construction Group for 9 years and had known me since before David took the job there. We'd worked adjacent to each other on a county infrastructure project in 2017, and she was the kind of person who remembered birthdays and kept her word. I picked up on the second ring. Thomas. She didn't say hello. That told me something before she said anything else. "Patricia." I set down my pencil. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm telling you because you're his father, and because I think you already know most of it." She paused. "I pulled his emergency contact file this morning. The whole HR record. You're still listed. Thomas. Your name, your cell number, your address on Elmwood. It's never been changed. Not once." I didn't say anything right away. Through the window of my home office, the birch tree in the backyard was dropping leaves in slow, irregular intervals. I watched one fall and land on the patio stones. "How long ago did he start at Meridian?" I asked. 4 years in January. 4 years of emergency contact forms, annual benefits reviews where an employee confirms or updates their records, open enrollment every October, where the system prompts you to verify your listed contacts before proceeding. David would have seen my name at least 4 times in 4 years. He had never removed it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "There's more." Her voice dropped slightly, not quieter, more careful. "This afternoon, around 2 o'clock, I was passing the men's restroom near the project coordination wing. I heard someone inside, crying." She stopped. "I know what that sounds like. Thomas. This wasn't someone having a rough moment. This was someone who had been holding something for a long time and couldn't hold it anymore. Have you ever stood outside a door and known exactly who was on the other side without being able to see them? I had. I knew before she said his name. I waited. When he came out, it was David. He didn't see me at first. He walked past, and I heard him say something not to me, just to himself, or maybe to the air. He said a name, Rebecca, and then he said, "I can't do this anymore." The birch tree dropped another leaf. I watched it. "He didn't see you?" I asked. "He saw me when he turned the corner." He looked startled. I told him I was just heading to the copy room. He nodded and kept walking. She paused again. "Thomas, I've been in HR for a long time. I know what it looks like when someone is about to break. He's close." I thanked her. She asked if there was anything she could do. I told her the most useful thing she could do was exactly what she'd done: observe, document, and call me if she saw anything else. She said she would. Before she hung up, she said, "You're still his emergency contact. Thomas, he knows that." I sat with that for a few minutes after the call ended. The load calculation spreadsheet was still open on my screen. The numbers hadn't changed. I closed the file and opened a different document, the one I'd been maintaining for 3 weeks. The one with dates and observations and phone logs and names. I added a new entry. 2:14 p.m., Thursday. Patricia Nguyen, HR, Meridian Construction Group, Seattle. Emergency contact record unchanged. Witnessed David crying. Hallway near Project Coordination Wing. Stated aloud Rebecca's name. Stated aloud, "I can't do this anymore." Witness Patricia Nguyen. Direct observation. Then I picked up my phone and called Mark Calloway. Mark answered on the third ring. I could hear the background noise of an open office keyboards, a distant printer, someone asking a question about a submittal deadline. Mark stepped away from the noise before he spoke. He was considerate that way. "Thomas, I was actually thinking about calling you today." "I know," I said. "Patricia told me about this afternoon." A brief pause. "She called you." "She did. Mark, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you respond." I kept my voice level. "David is going to reach a point in the next few days, possibly sooner, where he won't be able to manage at work. You'll see it. He'll come in, and something will be wrong, or he won't come in at all, or someone on his team will come to you and tell you he's not responding. When that happens, I need you to call me immediately. Not HR. Not a counseling line. Me." The office noise faded further. He'd moved somewhere private. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I've been watching the structure for 3 weeks. I said, when a load-bearing element is close to failure, there are signs. You learn to read them if you've been doing this long enough. David is close." I paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything except make one phone call. You'll know when." A longer silence this time. Not hesitation, consideration. Mark was a careful man. That was why David had thrived under his management, and why I'd trusted him enough to call. 3 weeks, he said. It wasn't a question. He was placing the timeline. 3 weeks, I confirmed. "All right," he said. "I'll call you." After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a while without turning the lamp on. The room went from late afternoon light to early evening gray, and I didn't move to change it. Outside, the birch tree was still. The last leaf I'd watched fall was somewhere on the patio stones, indistinguishable from the others now. David had never deleted my name. In every form, every annual review, every October enrollment cycle, he had looked at my name and left it there. That was not the action of someone who had cut contact. That was the action of someone who had been told to say he had, and who had found the one place where no one was watching and kept a door open anyway. The emergency contact field on an HR form is not something most people think about. It's a box you fill out once and forget. But David had seen it every year for 4 years, and every year he had made a choice. A small, quiet, private choice that no one had asked him to make, and no one could have forced him to undo. I added one more line to the document before I closed it for the night. He left the door open. He's been waiting for someone to walk through it. I turned the lamp on. I had work to finish. The second call came at 4:47 in the afternoon. I was at my drafting table, a half-finished cup of coffee going cold at the edge of the paper, when my phone lit up with Mark's number. I had saved it after the first call 3 weeks ago, not because I expected him to call again, but because I save every number that matters. That's a habit from a previous life. I picked up on the second ring. Mr. Calloway. Mark's voice was different from the first call, quieter, more careful. I'm sorry to call again. I wouldn't. But something happened this afternoon. I set down my pencil. The drafting table has a small lamp angled over the paper, and the rest of the room was dim. I didn't move to turn on the overhead light. Tell me. David received a text message about 40 minutes ago. I was in the open office when it happened. I wasn't watching him specifically. I was walking back from the conference room, but I heard it. I heard him. Mark paused. He was at his desk. He had his head down, and he was crying. Not quietly. He was trying to be quiet, but he wasn't. I didn't say anything. I've learned that silence, held correctly, makes people keep talking. They fill it. They say things they might otherwise edit. I brought him into my office. Mark continued. Close the door. I don't know how to describe it. He kept saying he needed to call his father. He said it several times. He said, "She told me I couldn't call, but I can't take it anymore." Those were his exact words. I wrote them down. The lamp on the drafting table made a small circle of light on the load calculations. Outside the window, Portland was doing what Portland does in October: gray sky, wet pavement, the sound of a truck somewhere on the street below. Is he still in your office? I asked. Yes, I can hear him through the door. He's trying to hold it together. A pause. There's crying in the background. That's him. There was, faint, through 2 layers of phone and a closed office door, but unmistakable. A man trying to breathe through something that isn't letting him breathe. I recognized it the way you recognize a sound you haven't heard in 30 years and didn't know you'd been listening for. Have you ever heard your child cry and known, before a single word was spoken, exactly how serious it was? Can you put him on? I said. He's scared. Mark's voice dropped lower, as though David might hear through the wall. He said if she finds out he called, he stopped there. He didn't finish the sentence, but he wants to talk to you. He's been saying your name. Another pause. I'm going to hand him the phone. I heard the door, and then footsteps, and then a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind you can feel pressing through a speaker. Dad. The word landed the way it always does when a grown man says it and means it completely. Not a greeting, not a formality. The whole thing, the 35 years, the drives to Seattle, the coffee at the kitchen table, the blueprints spread out on the living room floor when he was 12 and wanted to understand how bridges held weight. All of it compressed into one syllable, shaking at the edges. I'm here, I said. Dad, I'm sorry. His voice broke on the second word and he stopped, and I heard him working to get it back. I'm sorry I cut contact. I didn't want to. She said I had to. She said if I didn't, she would. He stopped again. I waited. She said she'd leave. David said she said I had to choose, and I made the wrong choice. I knew it was wrong. I knew it the day I did it, and I've known it every day since. And I couldn't fix it because every time I thought about calling you, she was there. And his breath hitched. She checks my phone. She checks it every night. I collapsed at work today because she sent me a message saying she'd found a charge on our account she didn't approve. And it was a lunch. It was just a lunch. And she wrote back, He didn't finish that sentence either. David, I said. I can't take it anymore. Dad. The words came out flat, exhausted, the way words sound when they've been held in too long and finally get air. I can't. I've been crying at my desk for 3 weeks. Mark thinks I have a family emergency. He's been covering for me in meetings. I can't do my job. I can't sleep. I can't. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I don't recognize myself. The drafting table lamp threw the same small circle of light. The load calculations were still there, the numbers unchanged. I looked at them without reading them. I had spent 3 weeks building a case. I had documents. I had bank records David didn't know I'd been watching. I had a conversation with Patricia, who had told me things she probably shouldn't have, and had told them to me anyway, because she'd known me for 22 years, and because she'd seen what I'd seen. I had a folder on my computer that was organized the way I used to organize evidence files by date, by source, by weight of relevance. I had been preparing for a conversation. I had not been preparing for this one. "Listen to me," I said. "You don't have to explain anything right now. You don't have to explain anything at all." A long exhale through the phone. Then, "She made me do it. Dad, I know that's not an excuse. I know I'm the one who—" "David," I kept my voice level. "I know." Silence. "What do you mean you know?" "I mean I know," I said. "Not everything, but enough. And the rest will get to the rest. Right now, I need you to do one thing." He waited. "Stay where you are. Don't go home tonight." Another silence. Longer this time. Then, "Okay." I told him I'd call back within the hour. I thanked Mark when he came back on the line. He said, quietly, that he'd been hoping someone was going to call. I told him someone had. I hung up and sat for a moment at the drafting table. The load calculations were still waiting. The retaining wall in Beaverton still needed its numbers checked. I closed the folder and opened a different one. The attorney's office was on the 11th floor of a building I had driven past for 20 years without ever going inside. Sandra Voss had been recommended to me by a colleague at the firm, a man named Glenn, who had handled his own estate restructuring after a difficult divorce, and when I'd first called her 3 weeks ago. The same afternoon, David's line went dead. She had asked me 2 questions before scheduling the appointment. The first was about the nature of the assets. The second was about whether I had reason to believe someone might contest the arrangement. I told her yes to the second question without elaborating. She said, "Then come in as soon as you can." The office smelled like paper and something faintly floral, a small diffuser on the windowsill, white ceramic, the kind my wife used to keep in the hallway. Sandra was in her mid-50s, precise in the way that people who work with language for a living tend to be precise. She set the amended document on the desk between us and walked me through it without rushing. The structure was straightforward, the way good engineering tends to be straightforward, not simple, but clear. The trust would hold the full value of the estate, the house on Burnside, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio my wife and I had built over 31 years. David was the sole beneficiary. That hadn't changed. What had changed was the mechanism of access. The funds would not transfer directly to him. They would remain in the trust until one of 2 conditions was met. David reached the age of 40, or a designated trustee, a position I had assigned to Glenn, who had no connection to Rebecca, certified in writing that David was making financial decisions independently, without the involvement or influence of a third party. Sandra looked up from the document. "This language is specific enough to hold, if someone attempts to access these funds, through David a joint account, a power of attorney, a loan arrangement, the trust structure blocks it. Any attempt to circumvent it triggers automatic review." She paused. "She won't be able to touch this." I looked at the page. The numbers were familiar. The address of the house was familiar. My wife's name appeared once, in the preamble, as it had in the original will. I read that line twice. "There's one more thing," Sandra said. She turned to the final page. "The trustee certification clause. If David comes to Glenn and demonstrates independent decision-making documented, verifiable, the trust can release early, before 40. This isn't a punishment. It's a gate." That was the word I had used when I first described it to her. A gate, not a wall. I picked up the pen. The desk was solid oak, the kind that doesn't move when you press against it. I signed where Sandra indicated 3 places, initials on the amendments, full signature on the final page. She signed as witness. Her assistant, a young man named Theo, who had been in the room since we started, countersigned and dated each page. Sandra gathered the documents into a folder and set it to one side. "Your son doesn't know about this." "No." And you want it to stay that way for now." "Until he's ready," I said. "He's not ready yet." She nodded once, the way people nod when they understand something that doesn't require further comment. Theo made copies. I took the originals in a plain manila envelope and rode the elevator down alone. The drive back to Portland took 40 minutes. The Willamette was flat and gray under the afternoon light, the same color it had been the morning David called me from Seattle to tell me he'd gotten the project manager position. That was 4 years ago. He'd called from his car, still in the parking lot, too excited to wait until he got home. I remembered the sound of traffic in the background, the way his voice cracked slightly on the word Dad. The house was quiet when I got back. I set the envelope in the fireproof box in the study, the same box where I kept the deed to the house and my wife's death certificate. Then I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat down at the table. The folder I'd closed before leaving was still on the drafting table in the next room. The Beaverton retaining wall still needed its numbers. There were things that still required attention, still required work. I drank the coffee and looked at the window and waited. David would call, not because I told him to stay put though I had, not because Mark had intervened though he had. David would call because he had left me as his emergency contact 5 months ago and never changed it, and that was not an accident. A person does not forget to remove a name from a form. A person leaves it there because some part of them is not ready to let go. I knew that. I had known it since Patricia told me. The coffee went cold. I drank the last of it anyway and rinsed the cup and set it in the rack. Then I went back to the drafting table, opened the Beaverton folder, and picked up where I had left off. David called at 11:14 that morning. Not from his cell phone, from Mark's office line. I recognized the area code before I picked up. Seattle, 206. Mark had given me his direct number the night before, after we'd spoken for 40 minutes, and he'd agreed to stay close to David through the morning. I answered on the second ring. "Mr. Calloway." Mark's voice, steady, but lower than it had been the night before. "He's here. He came in early. He's been in the conference room since 7:30. I thought you should know before I put him on." I set down my pencil. "Is he all right?" "No," Mark said, "but he's ready to talk." There was a pause, the sound of a door, footsteps on a hard floor, and then the line shifted. A different quality of silence. Smaller room, or a man holding the phone too close. "Dad." David's voice was the same voice I'd heard for 35 years. Lower now, rougher at the edges. The way voices get when a person has been crying for a long time and trying not to show it. But the same voice. "I'm here," I said. He didn't speak for a moment. I heard him breathe. Mark was somewhere in the room. I could hear the faint sound of a chair, the ambient hum of an office building at mid-morning. Mark was not pretending to give them privacy. He had told me he would stay. I had asked him to. "I don't know where to start," David said. "You don't have to start anywhere," I said. "I already know." Another silence. This one was different, not the silence of a man gathering words, but the silence of a man who has just been told the floor he's been standing on is solid. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know about the money," I said. "I know she took the joint account down to $1,100 over 6 weeks. I know she told you it was for rent, and I know the apartment lease is in her name, only has been since February. I know she threatened you. I know what she said she would do if you called me." I paused. "I know you didn't want to cut contact. I know that because you left me as your emergency contact at Harmon Group and never changed it. A man who is done with his father changes that form. You didn't." The sound David made was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when something that has been held under pressure for a very long time is finally allowed to surface. I have heard that sound before in interview rooms, in depositions, in conversations with people who have been carrying something too heavy for too long. It is not a pleasant sound, but it is an honest one. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice had broken completely now, and he was not trying to hold it together. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. She said if I called you, if I talked to you at all, she would hurt herself. She said it would be my fault. She said I was the only thing keeping her from—" He stopped. She said it every time I tried to leave. Every time. And I believed her. I kept believing her. I let him finish. I did not interrupt, and I did not fill the silence with reassurance before he was done. That is a thing I learned a long time ago, that reassurance offered too early is just another way of asking a person to stop talking before they've said everything they need to say. When he was quiet, I said, "What she described to you is a control mechanism. It has a name. Therapists call it emotional hostage-taking, the threat of self-harm used to prevent someone from leaving or seeking outside contact. It is not love. It is not crisis. It is a method, and she has used it on you deliberately and repeatedly." I kept my voice level, not cold level. There is a difference. She is not going to hurt herself, David. She is going to find another method when this one stops working. That is what the pattern shows. A pause from his end. Then, quietly, "How do you know the pattern?" "Because I spent 11 years doing this for a living before I went back to engineering," I said, "and because I've been watching her behavior for 4 months. Mark spoke then not loudly, but clearly enough that I could hear him from wherever he was standing in that room. "David," he said, "your father is right. I've seen this dynamic before. I had an employee years ago who was in the same situation. It took him 2 years to get out. You're not alone in this." David didn't respond to Mark directly. He said, "To me, I was scared to call you. I was scared you'd be angry." "I'm not angry," I said. "I was never angry. I was waiting." "For what?" "For you to be ready," I said, "and for everything to be in place." I heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the kind that carries something out of the body that has been lodged there for weeks. "What do you mean, in place?" "I mean, I have a lawyer," I said. "His name is Gerald Fitch. He's been working on this for 3 weeks. I have documentation of the financial transfers, all of them, with timestamps. I have a record of the lease discrepancy. I have records of 2 prior relationships where the same pattern appeared, same threat. Different men. Rebecca cannot touch you legally. She cannot claim anything from your accounts because her name was removed from the joint account authorization before the withdrawals began. I had you check that in February. Do you remember? You thought I was being overcautious. I was not being overcautious." Another silence, longer this time. "You prepared all of that," David said. "Not a question." "Yes." "Well, I wasn't talking to you." "Yes." Mark said something to David that I didn't catch his voice too low, too far from the phone. David said, "I know." Then, back to me. "I want to leave. I want to go today. But I don't have anywhere to go. My stuff is still at the apartment, and I'm scared she'll—" "You're coming to Portland," I said. "Tonight, if you can get on the road by 2. Your room is the same. I changed the sheets last week." I paused. "You don't need to go back to the apartment. Gerald has already sent a letter to her attorney of record. She knows the documentation exists. She will not escalate." "How do you know she has an attorney?" "Because I'm a thorough person," I said, "and because she filed a small claims action against a former partner in 2019. Same attorney. Gerald found it in the public record." David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, not the broken sound from before, but something steadier, something that sounded like a man standing up after sitting down for a very long time. "Mark," he said. "Yeah," Mark said. "I need to take the rest of the day." "Already approved," Mark said. "Take the week. HR will handle the paperwork. Patricia's already been notified. She said to tell you she's glad you're okay." I heard David breathe again. Then, "Dad." "I'm here." "I'm going to drive down today." "I know," I said. "I'll have dinner ready." I hung up first, not because I had nothing more to say, but because there was nothing more that needed to be said in that moment. The rest could wait for the table, for the drive, for the weeks ahead. Some conversations are better had in person, with food between you and a door that doesn't need to be locked. I went back to the drafting table. The Beaverton folder was still open to the page I'd left. I looked at it for a moment, then closed it and set it aside. There was dinner to think about. The call from Patricia came in at 2:14 in the afternoon. While I was at the kitchen counter slicing onions for the stew, I recognized her number and set the knife down before I answered. "Thomas," she said, "Rebecca just called the office." I dried my hands on a dish towel. "Tell me what she said." Patricia's voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had worked HR for 19 years and had heard most things at least twice. She identified herself as David's girlfriend and said she was trying to locate him. I told her David wasn't available. Then she said, Patricia paused, just briefly. She said to tell David that if he doesn't come back, she's going to hurt herself, that it would be his fault. The kitchen was quiet. The onions were still on the cutting board. "Patricia," I said, "did you record it?" "I record everything. Thomas, this is a workplace." I asked her to send me the file. She said it would be in my email within 10 minutes. I thanked her, and after I hung up, I stood at the counter for a moment without moving. Outside the window, the neighbor's maple was losing the last of its leaves. I watched two of them come down while I thought through what I had and what still needed to happen. Then I called my attorney. Dennis Hale had handled my estate work for 11 years. He was not the kind of lawyer who needed background. He kept notes, and he read them before every call. When he answered, I told him what Patricia had recorded, and I told him what I already had the financial transfer records David had shown me before the cutoff, the text messages I'd screenshotted when David briefly reconnected 3 weeks in, the timeline I'd documented from the first month Rebecca began isolating him from anyone who knew him before her. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then, you've got psychological coercion, potential financial fraud, and now a documented threat designed to induce guilt and prevent separation. That's a pattern. I know what it is, I said. We can send a cease and desist. If she contacts David's workplace again, contacts David directly with threats, or contacts you any of it we file, the recording alone is enough to establish the pattern in front of a judge. I told him to draft the letter. He said he'd have it ready by end of day, and that his paralegal would file the accompanying documentation. Before we hung up, he said, "Thomas, this is a clean case. She overplayed it." Yes, I said she did. I went back to the onions. They needed another 10 minutes before the broth went in, and I had a call left to make, so I turned the burner to low and sat down at the kitchen table with my phone. David picked up on the second ring. His voice was different from the morning quieter, but not fragile. Something had settled in him during the drive north, or maybe during whatever he and Mark had said to each other after I'd gotten off the phone. I didn't know yet. I would ask him at dinner. "David," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you respond." He said, "Okay." "Rebecca called your office this afternoon. She told the HR department that if you don't go back to her, she would hurt herself, and that it would be your fault." I heard him start to speak, and I kept going. "I know what that does to you. I know exactly what it does. But I want you to understand something. I've been documenting this for 3 months. The financial transfers, the messages, the pattern of who you stop seeing, and when. Patricia recorded today's call. My attorney has everything, and he's drafting a cease and desist letter tonight. If she contacts you, contacts your workplace, or contacts me again, we file." The line was very still. "She can't keep using that threat," I said. "Not anymore. There are people who know now. There's a record. You are not responsible for her choices, and you never were." David said, "Dad, I'm scared." "I know you are." "I've been scared for 8 months. Every time I tried to pull back, He stopped. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't think anyone would understand what it felt like." "I understood," I said. "That's why I waited." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You knew." "I suspected. Then I knew. Then I spent 3 months making sure I could prove it in a way that would actually help you, not just tell you what I thought. You needed the ground to be solid before you stepped onto it." Another silence. Outside, the maple had gone still. "You're safe now," I said. "Not because I fixed it, because we have enough that she can't hold it over you anymore. That's different." I heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the kind that carries more weight coming out than it does going in. "I'll be there by 6, he said. "I know. Drive carefully. The 5 gets slow around Salem." After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for another minute. The stew was simmering. The light through the window had shifted to the flat gray that comes in late October in Portland, the kind that makes everything look like it's waiting for something. I thought about the 8 months David had spent in a room where every exit seemed to cost something. I thought about the particular discipline it takes to stay scared and stay silent and believe that no one would understand. I turned the burner back up and added the broth. He would be here in 4 hours. There was still time to do this right. Rebecca's attorney received the cease and desist letter on a Tuesday. Gerald told me she had 72 hours to respond. She did not call Gerald, she called Meridian. Mark told me about it the same afternoon. He had been in his office with the door open when his assistant, a woman named Corinne who had been with the firm for 7 years, appeared in the doorway and said there was a woman on the main line asking to speak to David directly. She had given her name as Rebecca. She said it was a personal emergency. Mark came out to the reception desk himself. Corinne was still holding the handset, her hand over the mouthpiece. 2 project coordinators were at the adjacent workstations, Ray, who had been there when David said, "I can't" in the break room, and a younger man named Seth, who had started 6 months ago and did not know any of this history. Both of them were watching. Mark took the phone. "This is Mark Calloway, Operations Director. David isn't available." Rebecca's voice came through clearly enough that Corinne could hear it from 2 feet away. She told Mark it was urgent. She said David needed to come home. She said if he didn't, she couldn't be responsible for what happened to her. Mark said, "I'm going to stop you there. David is not available, and this line is recorded. If you contact this office again, we will treat it as workplace harassment and involve our legal team." He paused. "Do you understand?" The line went quiet for a moment. Then she hung up. Mark set the handset down on Corinne's desk. He looked at Ray, then at Seth, then back at Corinne. Nobody said anything. Corinne pulled up the call log on her screen, noted the time, and saved the recording to the HR folder without being asked. She had been doing this job for 7 years. She knew what to do. Mark called me at 3:42 that afternoon. He told me the whole thing in the same even voice he used for everything, the voice of a man who manages people for a living and knows how to deliver information without editorializing. When he finished, he said, "She thought nobody was watching. 3 people were watching." "I know," I said. "Thank you, Mark." I called Gerald and told him to add the call log and Corinne's recording to the file. He said it was the 3rd documented incident in 4 days. He said, "Thomas, she's building the case for us." "Yes," I said, "she is." My attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had handled my affairs for 14 years, sent it certified mail to the apartment in Los Angeles and copied it to her employer's HR department. It documented the financial coercion, the isolation strategy, the recorded phone calls. Gerald told me she had 72 hours to respond before he filed in civil court. She did not respond to Gerald. She responded to David. The first call came that same Tuesday evening. David was sitting at my kitchen table eating the stew I'd made the night before, reheated, with bread from the bakery 2 blocks down. His phone lit up on the table between us. He looked at it, then he turned it face down and kept eating. I said nothing. The second call came 11 minutes later. He turned the phone over, looked at the screen, turned it back down. The third call came at 9:47 that night. While David was in the guest room with the door half open, I heard his phone buzz 3 times on the nightstand. It stopped. The house was quiet after that. The texts came the next morning. I know because David showed them to me, which I had not expected. He walked into the kitchen while I was making coffee, set his phone on the counter in front of me without a word, and went to sit at the table. I read them. There were 11 messages sent between 10:15 and 11:52 the previous night. The first 4 were apologies. The 5th was an explanation of why the apologies were actually someone else's fault. The 6th through 9th cycled back to apologies, each one longer and more detailed than the last. each one containing the phrase, "I will change," in a slightly different form. The 10th asked if David had talked to a lawyer. The 11th said she loved him. She called my number at 7:14 the following morning. I was in the kitchen. David was still asleep. I answered on the second ring and did not say anything beyond my name. Thomas. Her voice was different from the call she'd placed to Meridian. No urgency, no performance. Careful. She was calibrating. I think we should talk. Without lawyers. I said nothing. I have learned that silence, held correctly, makes people say what they've already decided to say faster than any question would. David is confused right now, she said. He's been under a lot of stress, and I think being around you is making it harder for him to think clearly. You've always had a lot of influence over him. I'm sure you know that. I let that sit in the air for a moment. I love him, she said. I know you don't believe that, but I do. And I think if you actually cared about what was best for him, you'd encourage him to come back and work through this with me instead of… Rebecca, I said. She stopped. My attorney's name is Gerald Foss. His number is on the letter you received Tuesday. If you have something to say it to him. A silence. Then, I'm trying to have a conversation with you. I know, I said. This isn't a conversation. I heard her take a breath, the kind that precedes a change in strategy. David is going to regret this. You know that. He always comes back to me. Every time he's tried to leave, he… Goodbye, Rebecca. I hung up. I set the phone face down on the counter. Through the ceiling, I could hear the faint sound of David moving in the guest room, a drawer, footsteps, the particular creak of the floorboard near the window that had been there since 1994 and that I had never bothered to fix because I had always liked knowing where people were in the house. He appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, still in yesterday's clothes, his hair uneven from sleep. He looked at my face. Was that hurt? He asked. Yes, I said. What did she want? To negotiate, I said. Coffee. He sat down at the table. I poured 2 cups. Neither of us said anything else about it, and we didn't need to. He had heard enough of my side of the call to understand what had happened, and more importantly, to understand that it hadn't worked. That was the part that mattered, not what she had said, what it had not produced. I set the phone down on the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee. David wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out of the window at the yard. The oak in the back corner had dropped most of its leaves by then. What was left was wet and flat against the ground. He stayed 2 weeks. He did not talk much, and I did not ask him to. That was the agreement we reached without ever discussing it in the same way we'd always reached agreements, through proximity and parallel motion rather than declared terms. He slept until 8 most mornings. He ate what I made. In the evenings, he sat on the couch with a book he wasn't really reading, and I sat in the chair across from him doing the same, and neither of us needed to explain that. Some evenings, he helped me in the kitchen. He'd learned to cook the way most people learn things under pressure by watching someone do it without being taught. He knew how to deglaze a pan, how long onions need before they stop being sharp, how to tell when rice is done by the sound it makes, not the clock. His mother had shown him. He didn't say that, but I knew. On the 4th night, he asked me when I had first understood what Rebecca was doing. I told him honestly around the 6th week after he moved to Los Angeles, when the pattern of his calls changed. Not the frequency, the texture, the pauses before he answered questions, the way he'd started framing his own opinions as things he'd heard somewhere, as if he needed the distance of attribution to say what he actually thought. I told him I'd seen that pattern before, in a different context, in a different decade, and that recognizing it was not the same as knowing what to do with it. He nodded. He didn't ask what I'd done with it. He already knew most of it by then. Mark Hendricks called on the 9th day. I answered because David was in the shower and the call came to my number, not his. Mark said the project team was asking about David's return timeline, that there was a bridge assessment starting the following Monday, and David was the only one who had the full site history. He said it carefully, the way people say things when they're trying to be helpful without applying pressure. I told him David was here. I told him David was well. I told him I'd pass the message along. That evening, I mentioned it at dinner. David set down his fork and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to go back. I need to go back." He said it the way someone says a thing they've been rehearsing, not because it wasn't true, but because they needed to hear themselves say it out loud before they could be sure. I said, "You'll go back, but you're staying here at night until you're ready to have your own place again. Not her place. Yours." He picked his fork back up. "That's going to be a long commute. 3 hours each way," and I said, "I've done worse." He almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile. It was the corner of one, the kind that means a person remembers how smiling works but isn't quite there yet. I had not seen his face do that in a long time. I counted it. Rebecca's name did not come up again that week. Gerald called me on Friday to confirm she had vacated the apartment and that her employer had initiated a review based on the documentation he'd forwarded to HR. He said the civil matter would likely resolve without going to court, given what was on record. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch. After I hung up, David was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He'd heard enough to know the shape of it. "Is it over?" he asked. I thought about the question for a moment, not the legal answer that was straightforward, the other answer. For her, yes. I said, "For you, it's just starting again." He stood there for another second. Then he came in and started washing the dishes from dinner, and I dried them, and we put everything back where it belonged. 3 weeks after he moved to Los Angeles, I received a letter from Rebecca. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten on cream stationery, addressed to me at the Portland house. She had looked up the address. I noticed that people who look up addresses believe they still have leverage. The letter asked if I would speak to David on her behalf. It said she missed him. It said there had been misunderstandings. It said she hoped I could find it in my heart to encourage him to reach out. The handwriting was careful and even, the kind of penmanship that takes effort to produce. I read it twice, set it on the kitchen counter, and made coffee. When the coffee was done, I folded the letter back along its original crease and put it in the file I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk, the same drawer where I had kept every document, every note, every printed email for the past 4 months. Then I went to work. I never responded, not because I was angry, because there was nothing to say. Have you ever known someone who stayed, not someone who promised to stay, not someone who said the right things at the right moments, but someone who actually remained without announcement, without conditions, even after you told them to leave, someone who understood the difference between a door being closed and a door being locked, and who knew which one yours was? David called on a Thursday evening, about 2 weeks after that letter arrived. He was in his apartment in Los Angeles, and I was at my drafting table in Portland, working on a retaining wall calculation for a project in Beaverton. He didn't apologize again. We had already done that, carefully and honestly, the week before. This call was different. He wanted to know how I had known not about Rebecca, not about the money, but about him, how I had known he would come back. I told him I hadn't known. I had believed it, which is a different thing. Knowing requires certainty. Believing requires only that you've paid enough attention to the person to trust what you see underneath what they're saying. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You never stopped watching out for me." I said, "That's what I was built for." That's the thing about being a father that no one tells you clearly enough. It isn't about fixing things. It isn't about having answers, or money, or the right words at the right time. It's about remaining in the field of view. A good father doesn't solve every problem his child encounters. He makes sure the child knows the field is not empty, that someone is still there, watching, cataloging, preparing, waiting for the moment when the preparation becomes useful. The silence isn't absence. The silence is work. One sentence, that's all David needed. In the end, not a speech, not an explanation, not a history of everything I had done while he was gone. One sentence in a conference room, delivered at the right moment to the right person, with the right documentation in hand. Everything I had built over 4 months collapsed into a single exchange that lasted less than 30 seconds. That's how it works, if you do it correctly. The preparation is invisible. Only the result is seen. Rebecca is in Phoenix now. I know this because Patricia mentioned it briefly in passing. The way you mention weather, David doesn't ask about her. I don't bring her up. The retaining wall in Beaverton is finished. I drove out to see it last week, poured concrete. Clean angles, holding back 40 tons of Pacific Northwest hillside without any visible effort. The engineer who designed it is invisible in the structure. That's the point. That's always the point. David is coming up from Los Angeles next month. He said he wants to drive the Coast Road, the one we used to take when he was 12, the one that takes twice as long but runs along the water. I told him I'd check my schedule. I already cleared it. If you've ever stayed quiet when everything in you wanted to speak, not because you had nothing to say, but because you were still building the thing that would say it better, then you already understand what this story was really about. It was never about winning. It was about being ready when the moment finally came, and being the kind of person your son can drive a coast road with afterward. If these stories find something true in you, I'll keep telling them.